Mm. So this idea of peace building versus peacekeeping is really important. Peacekeeping is passive, and passivity, if that's a word, being passive, um, is something that we've done in the past. And I have empathy for why. Most people have been passive, including my parents and their generation and other generations, because it was a safety measure. I don't sit in this chair with any level of arrogance that suggests what I'm saying is the only way. It is a partial truth. And I am offering insight to the fact that that no longer works. To keep the peace is passive, is to keep the status quo. Is to keep the status quo in ourselves, even though we know that there's a war going on with all or majority of the decisions we've made. Peace building is more active. It's more, we need to find the building blocks to do this. But the invitation I give is that it needs to be on a different ground, a different area to where we have kept the peace for as long as we have. It's the equivalent of nurturing soil. You want to plant something. You don't go back into the place where you planted something else and either you had some weeds come in and take over. You literally need to go to a different place. Now, some people try to dig it up and it works sometimes, but we've been trying to dig this shit up for decades and centuries. The invitation is to find different fertile ground. So the way this can actually look in ourselves, and I gave one example of me moving geographically, and I appreciate that, you know, some people could see that as running. And I understand why they would, because whatever happens, you still have to deal with it. But in order for me to have a fighting chance, I needed to move. My sister literally just messaged me about a few minutes before we came on and had this chat. And she said, sis, do you think, and this was her making reference to the amount of sunlight we get in Australia, do you think, have you lived a happier life in moving? And has your vitamin D improved? And I said, vitamin D definitely has improved, still have a deficiency. So there's always still work to do, regardless of where you move. I just want to make this relevant to the question you asked. But I actually said, it has given me the space to do the healing work that has allowed my mindset to grow, which has had a direct impact in successful businesses and relationships. So without a shadow of a doubt, that geographical move was important for me because that it was a different ground. It was fertile for me to be able to build stuff. Another example that people can, build peace is boundaries. What are the boundaries? Prentice Hemphill, they say it brilliantly. Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me, meaning that I can still love you, even though you might be part of the source of the war within me. I can still love you, but I needn't be around you. And it could be as simple as, those events and those parties you used to invite me to, I don't think I'm going to those anymore. I know that they're a family tradition, but I don't think I'm going. So you actually stop going to that location. Another one, and this is a big one, and I might be moving in all sorts of directions here, but another way we can build peace. This is a rough one. I'm getting what I call my downloads, which is, Yemi, is it safe for you to share this? And it is. Part of me building peace, oh, I'm nervous, was to open up the idea of dating different races. And I'm just going to pause with that for a second to just see how that lands in my body. Because at the time it was unknowingly, but as time has gone on, the idea of my Blackness and the weight that is associated with it, with this construct of race and the racism that Black and brown bodies face, I felt there was too much trauma bonding for when I was within some of those relationships. And so for me, peace building was to change my thinking of I can only be with one race because that's what the rules say. So it can be in any light. And I've given a range of different examples that don't just mean it's one thing for all. Okay, that's a big one. So the saying, hurt people has become way more familiar with a lot of people around the world. And I really still believe it. Hurt people do hurt people. But my work is flipping the script, not completely erasing that saying, but giving an alternative, which once again is the whole act of distancing ourselves, of healed people heal people. This really is the basis of building peace. It's actually, why don't we create a new paradigm? Why don't we create a new belief? Why don't we create a new series of events? And these series of events are people healing themselves so that they can heal more people. Now, if I take this to me and how I have managed and continue to, because it's continuous, and this is what my research and other research is showing, is the war that was within me in particular, the story that really keeps on coming up is I just couldn't seem to hold down a relationship. And this is a relationship in my adults. So this is the story I was telling myself, because remember, a lot of us have signed up to the story and the memo, as I call it, which is you get married, 2.4 kids, white picket fence, and we're talking heteronormative relationships. That was the only model we've ever been given. And in recent years and decades, I'm like, oh, there were other models. I could have had feelings for other people. I could have had the makeup of my family be different. So I'm saying this on the premise that part of the war inside me was the fact that there only seemed to be one model I was following, and it felt really uncomfortable. And one of these models was that I was meant to do always and forever with one person, and to not live that through with the other responsibility of being a girl, a woman, the first girl in a family with really deep cultural roots of making sure you keep home and your husband happy forever, regardless of what happens. I mean, I've mentioned about 10 things in the space of a couple of seconds. That is war. I'm trying to uphold all these different paradigms, which please understand, I'm not trying to throw any shade on, because it has worked for many people, but it didn't work for me. And what I did was I joined in on the war by beating myself down for not being able to stay in that relationship, to stay with the father of my daughter, and then to get married, move to Japan, live on a military base, then move back to the UK. And so I myself was adding to the war inside of me. And so it really got to a point when I found myself in Japan, Okinawa, kind of trying to change everything in my life. I became this stay-at-home mom, despite having this first class in mechanical engineering at Brunel University in the UK. And I say that with pride now. But for me, it was like, oh, whoa, but the world isn't set up for me that way, because I need to be a housewife. And I became, a military dependent. I mean, it doesn't get more obscene than that when I talk about the war in myself, and where I started to really heal. That was to acknowledge the discomfort, was to acknowledge the amount of mass destruction I was creating in myself by trying to uphold a way of being that just didn't seem natural for me. And when I talk about being natural, when it comes to, the work I do, was having balance. There just didn't seem to be balance. It just seemed that a lot of society has and continues to be built for the comfort of men. And I'm not suggesting that all men are comfortable. I don't think a lot of them are. But in general terms, it was more to protect and build them than it was for me as a woman and as a mother. And that's probably been one of the biggest conflicts that I've had in myself. And I just continue to do the work to say, actually, what's a new narrative I can do? And it always comes back to a level of distancing, to say the only way I can create something new and build peace within me was to distance myself. And one of those is I moved geographically. I moved from Japan at the time back to the UK, but the UK was a big source of the discomfort and the events that created the war in me. And so it was to move to Australia. Well, most of us have been taught to keep the peace from childhood, because we've all been taught about the power of peacekeeping. And to keep the peace, to keep status quo, means that nothing changes. It means that those who have been in power remain in power. And to keep those that have been in power to stay in power means that your level of anxiety, typically attached to uncertainty, isn't triggered. So it kind of makes sense why someone would say it. But here's the other side. Nothing new happens. We don't build anything new. We absolutely miss the opportunity to the creativity that lives within humanity naturally. Because if we have the same, because we've kept the same lines of power and keeping status quo and keeping the peace, then this idea of trying to find something new, even my research coming out, doesn't happen. I mean, I'm building peace by having completed a PhD because I wanted something different. I'm building peace because when my supervisor said, Yemi, why don't you do some research? One of them said, why don't you do some research on African women and how they have transformed their trauma? It was no, actually, because we're always under investigation and no one has decided to look at cultural trauma through different bodies. And so building peace is about challenging the status quo, but doing it gracefully and lovingly. Oh, I love the question of generational trauma versus generational healing. Dr. Tererai Trent, I met her, I was fortunate to meet her once. And I remember her saying, Yemi, when you do your work on trauma, please don't forget to talk about the generational wisdom. And I love that she reminded me. And it's always been the lens I wanted to look at. And I also know that in order for us to get to the healing aspect, we have to know what the trauma was. Otherwise, we don't know what it is we're trying to heal and or transform. So what I think of it is a beautiful invitation to someone along the lines of the 14 generations that research and data currently says that trauma can be transmitted. It's for us to just make the assumption that the wisdom can also be transmitted. So noting that a number of those generations no longer exist, let's get curious about what were the stories, what were the things that happened within those generations, and can we map? You know, I talk about trauma mapping, but what immediately follows is that healing mapping, that wisdom mapping. What are the things that exist in all the generations we know as far back? And then which one of us currently alive today, whether we're number 7 in the generational ladder, which one of us is going to decide to be the cycle breaker of any of the trauma that's no longer needed? And then it's to start taking this approach, and one of the frameworks that comes out of my research, to actually start building peace within ourselves first, which then acts as a ripple effect to our families and communities. That is how you break cycles. So some of the immediate steps that people could take, and I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again, depending on where you are in your journey of identifying any war within you, is just start with acknowledging it. Now, you might say, but hold up, what do you mean war? Because we term war with, sadly, what we're seeing around the world today. War can be discomfort. War can be cycles and patterns that keep happening that don't excite you. They're usually invitations. So just making an awareness of that. So the next time it happens, and you will know because you will say, oh, remember what that Yemi chick was saying? Yeah, this is it. I'm finding myself saying for the 10th time in 10 weeks, why does this keep happening to me? No blame, nothing but love. It's all about grace and love. And then just get curious about where this tension, where this conflict comes from. That's one step. The next step after that, because the acknowledgement really is important, is just the boundaries. And the boundaries don't have to always be against someone else. It can be against something else. So I've just created a new boundary that says, Yemi, you're going to take 6 weeks off the gym. And you know I'm creating 6 weeks off the gym because the war was happening within me as I go into perimenopause. My kneecaps can't take me jumping on that box no more. I will at some point. I don't want to limit myself, but I know I need to go take those vitamins I've been avoiding for a while. So boundaries don't always have to be against someone. It can be something, but it really requires you to stop long enough to figure out what is the war going on. And for me, I just realized that I need to just pause for a second. And it goes back to what I said, Auntie Miriam Rose from Australia, First Nations elder, Daddy, listen deeply to what's going on within you, name it, and then it could be as simple as creating that boundary. And that boundary sometimes is just a boundary for you to just take a breath and say, okay, this is no longer flourishing. Where do I need to move? And then the next one is, where do I need to move? There is a distance. So part of the biggest part of the research was most people found their transformation journey happen when they move. Some people, it was the generations before them geographically. I don't believe it always needs to be geographically. Some people, it could be jobs. Some people, it could be the house you are in. It could be the suburb you are in. And you need to see it as fertile ground, because what we don't want you to do is take the energy and the steps you've been doing to keep the peace, to just use that to build. We want a different type of energy. And it's an active one of wanting something new. Yeah. Oh, the connection between personal trauma and peace building came up because we're trauma fatigued. I mean, the word started surfacing on a public level in the millions and the billions in when the COVID pandemic started. And then we had George Floyd. And then we had Ukraine, Russia. In Australia, we had the no vote to give First Nations people the opportunity to have their voice in treaty. And then we had the attack in Israel, which then has caused the genocide in Palestine. And more continues that we don't even know about. So to say we're trauma fatigued, and then forget the recent, US elections that really had the ripple effect across the whole world. We can't ignore the fact that trauma is in our daily vocabulary, and we're feeling the effects, and we're struggling to figure out, well, how do we set up those boundaries? And that was when I started to think really deeply, what is the antithesis to talking about trauma? And it's peace. But that also seems obvious because we've had leaders before us who have spoken about peace. We've had Martin Luther King Jr., who showed us a nonviolent way to enact change. We've had amazing people like Harriet Tubman, who was an engineer and built tunnels to get people out. For me, that's peace building. That was active. That was, we are getting out of this place where you're creating war within our bodies and our communities. So we're going to build to get the fuck out of here. Peace building comes in different ways, but it's an alternative. They didn't feel, Harriet Tubman and the rest of the slaves feel like, well, we need to now enslave the people who have kept us enslaved. It was to create something different. And that was all about geographical movement as well. And, whether it's Mother Teresa. So for me, it was a case of, we've heard the term peace in a number of these ways, and they have served us in many ways. But how can I differentiate it just that little bit more? And it's about the building. It's about the active. It's about the invitation, the heads up to put us on notice that there is some work that needs to be done. But it won't be as exhausting as the one that we've been doing previously, some of us, which was to keep the peace, because we're not trying to do that.